Now, US President Donald Trump has become increasingly vocal in his support for political allies across Latin America, with Honduras his latest test case. In the final days of the country's presidential campaign, Donald Trump issued a high-profile endorsement of Conservative candidate Nasry Asfura. He warned that the United States could slash aid and investment if his preferred candidate lost. Mr. Asfura is one of two right-wingers leading the vote, well ahead of the candidate of the ruling left-wing party. Well, Donald Trump's involvement in the Honduran elections gone far beyond an endorsement. Days before the vote, he announced he would pardon a former Honduran president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's serving a 45-year sentence in the United States for cocaine trafficking. Hernandez was once accused by US prosecutors of turning Honduras into a narco-state. Speaking on board Air Force One, President Trump explained his thinking.
The people of Honduras really thought he was set up and it was a terrible thing. He was the president of the country, and they basically said he was a drug dealer because he was the president of the country. And they said it was a Biden administration setup, and I looked at the facts and I agreed with them.
Well, journalist Fritz Pinnow is in the Honduran capital, Tegucigalpa. Welcome to DW. So we have the right-wing candidate, the Conservative candidate, Nasry Asfura, in the lead. Very slightly. How surprising is that?
Well, it's definitely not surprising due to all these factors with Trump and the Trump endorsement. But what is a surprise is how close it actually is. Both have declared victory at some point in this last night, but they're also both very surprised that they're just separated by 1%, basically. And still about 45% of the votes have to be counted to be absolutely sure. But it's definitely a neck-on-neck race, and it's definitely not something that Trump has expected, for example, because what he would have expected is a massive turnout for Nasry Asfura, which has now turned into this neck-on-neck race.
And what do you put that down to? Is that people defying Trump? Is that people supporting their candidate? Why is this race so close?
I would say that's exactly the point. That Trump's endorsement initially had a lot of support, pushed a lot of support over to Nasry Asfura, but the mention of Juan Orlando Hernandez and the endorsement, and as well the pardoning that Trump has planned for Juan Orlando Hernandez, has still left like this bitter taste of the past presidency of the National Party, and has then again caused many to flock over to Nasrallah, to the centrist party. So I think it's been kind of an exchange for left and centrist with Trump's posts and tweets. So I think that's why it's so close.
And why do you think that the US president swung his support behind Asfura?
Well, the US has a very strong history and strong connection to the National Party, as well with Juan Orlando Hernandez back then. And he won a second term in an election that was considered to have been won by fraud, and the US backed him there as well. And then essentially he did become president due to this US backing and acceptance of that election. So it's definitely part of a larger history and relationship the US has to this party, because they do not hold back and they do not push back to US policy recommendations, for example.
Now, you mentioned a pardon to the former Honduran president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's been sentenced for drug trafficking in the US. Now, this is a weird thing for us out of the region to see. We have a US president who is parking a significant chunk of his navy off Venezuela's coast, saying that he's fighting narco-terrorists, while at the same time seeking to pardon a former Honduran president who has gone down for drugs offences. How do those two positions go together?
That's a great question. That's a question Hondurans are asking themselves as well, right? And this shows again that Trump is not that much interested in actual regional dynamics, but rather policy and economic policies in this case. Juan Orlando Hernandez has been a very close ally to the US during his presidency, also implementing special economic zones in which he actually leaped over the Constitution, and were in favor of US investment. Also, for example, investors that have backed Trump in his election, for example. So in this case, what we can actually see is a pivotal shift, which we know, okay, it's not that important to Trump anymore. Is he related to drug trafficking or not? But rather, is he a reliable economic ally or a reliable policy ally, for example?
That's very clear. Thanks for that analysis, Fritz. Journalist Fritz Pinnow.
Thank you very much.
Let's explore Donald Trump's interest in Latin America with Will Freeman, who is a fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to DW. Let's start with Honduras and how unusual it is for a US president to intervene this explicitly in a Latin American election.
Unusual for recent times. Since the end of the Cold War, we've really seen most presidents of either party pull back from this kind of explicit optics of seeming to be intervening, trying to back up one candidate and push down another. But not with this presidency. President Trump is making clear very much who he wants to win, who he wants to lose, who he thinks is trustworthy and untrustworthy as a U.S. ally. So it's rare for recent times. It harkens back to an older tradition, of course. Honduras was the country itself that in the U.S. press, U.S. writing gave rise to the idea of a banana republic, of course, because then the U.S. banana companies were backing candidates, rival candidates, and trying to gain control of the country's politics that way. So there is a long history, a long tradition here.
And what of Trump's threat not to throw good money after bad if Asfura loses? Is that just rhetoric, or could aid really be on the line?
It could be on the line, but you've actually seen this administration, I think, be a little more cautious with aid cuts in northern Central America, because this has been a region of so much outmigration to the United States. Even they understand that there needs to be a certain baseline of stability in these countries, or you could end up with a crisis situation at the border once again. So you've seen actually, in some cases, Guatemala exempted from large amounts of the recent foreign aid cuts. I've heard from some contexts in Guatemala, aid actually has increased over last year's levels there, despite all the changes, for instance, to USAID. And so I think that in this case, because it looks like it's either going to be a center-right or a right-wing candidate winning, I don't see Trump following through with those plans. I think regardless of if it's Asfura, his favorite candidate, or Nasrallah, and now we see they are tied, this is going to a recount. I think either way, probably there's more continuity here with the relationship than actually an abrupt change.
So if Asfura does win in Honduras and Trump's intervention is seen as decisive, do you expect more US-backed conservative realignments across the region?
Well, I think we'll certainly see more attempts to try. I think actually, regardless of had this worked or not, I think the Trump administration would have felt pretty confident, as they tend to do about most of their policy decisions. They would have felt pretty confident that it was worth trying to meddle and intervene in upcoming elections. I think they'll be watching the one in Colombia next year very closely, hoping to flip that to the right. The one in Brazil next year, for instance, both very consequential elections. But whether or not that leads to a long-lasting right-wing turn in the region, I'm more skeptical. So obviously that is the drift we see right now in the region's politics, but this is just a region that every few years swings one direction or the other. I mean, we've seen this, I don't forget how many times before. I mean, over half a dozen times since the return to democracy in the 80s and 90s. You get left, then you get right, then you go back to the left. Right. I don't really see many signs that something dramatically different and more durable is happening here. But whether or not attempts by the White House to reinforce that would actually work or backfire, I think you'd have to look at it very much on a case-by-case basis.
And what about this planned pardon of the former Honduran president, Juan Orlando Hernandez? Why would a supposedly anti-narco terrorist US president champion the release of a leader who US prosecutors described as the head of a narco-state?
For me, it's actually perfectly consistent with Trump's record last time in office, when he also claimed to be fighting organized crime, but often made decisions that seem very strange in that context that maybe undercut the mission itself. So you'll remember from last time, one, he had a very close working relationship with the Juan Orlando Hernandez government. I have no doubt that plenty of people in the U.S. government knew that there was organized crime, corruption there. I mean, the press in Honduras was denouncing it. The narco ties weren't exactly a secret. And yet he worked closely with that government, called them great partners because they were willing to cooperate on migration, especially. This was Trump won a government, an administration that sent back to Mexico the former head of the military, Salvador Cienfuegos, who U.S. federal prosecutors charged and arrested with narco trafficking or protecting narco traffickers on U.S. soil. So Trump just chose to send him back. And earlier this term, we've seen him send a leading gang member in U.S. custody back to El Salvador, precisely because he had started to talk about political corruption in that allied government, the government of Nayib Bukele. So for me, it's not new. It's not actually strange. This is perfectly par for the course with Trump. Some kind of theatrical optics attacking the foot soldiers or alleged foot soldiers of the drug trade, but meanwhile, not focusing at all or even taking backward steps on the question of high-level impunity that sustains so much of this illegal economy and others.
So where does this leave the Trump standoff with Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, whom he has called a narco-terrorist? Why is he? Are we likely to see more action there because he just doesn't like him?
Yeah, I don't. So I wouldn't make too many predictions on Venezuela based off what just happened in Honduras. I think these are two separately moving parts of administration policy. There, I think the dilemma is this. For weeks now, actually months, the Trump administration has been doing cyber rattling, psyops, using this military buildup to try to get generals around Nicolas Maduro, who really run the country with him, to flip on him and drive him out of office, arrest him, maybe even kill him. That's been the goal, and it's not working so far. It seems that there's more unity in the Venezuelan ranks than the administration counted on, at least from what we know at this point. And so now they're faced with a tough decision. Do they put U.S. boots on the ground in Venezuela, which there's not enough troops in the region right now for that to happen? We only have 15,000. It would take tens upon tens of thousands more to make that happen. Do they try to do a strike on Maduro himself? Do they try to assassinate him? Those are the real options they have for taking him out of power. It just doesn't seem likely that he's going to take off. So Trump has to face this difficult question. Does he now walk back and essentially admit that this was all a bluff and that he wasn't strong enough to pull it off? Or does he escalate? In which case, you're in one of these pretty dangerous scenarios that I just described.
Right. So as we see Trump meddling in this region, we have several countries like Colombia, Brazil, even Canada, diversifying trade away from the US and towards China and BRICS partners. Could this White House's hard line end up pushing that hemisphere into Beijing's orbit?
I think we have to look at the hemisphere in a few different parts. So South America is already in Beijing's orbit. That transformation happened over the last 20 years for almost all the big economies there. China is the largest trade partner, and in quite a few cases by a large margin over the United States. And in fact, that drift continued under Biden, it continued under Obama. And it's not really a one-to-one response with what the U.S. is, the tone or hostility or compassion of the way its leaders talk. This is just about the kind of hard and fast facts of what do these countries have to sell. It's largely soy, minerals, agricultural products that China's buying in large volumes that we actually don't buy. We're competitors. We supply those as well to global markets, energy, for instance, as well. So that shift's already done. I don't think this is going to have a major effect on it. And then meanwhile, when you look at Mexico and Central America, there actually the U.S. trade advantage over China in most countries has increased in the last few years. So they're more and more welded to us. And that's partly why you don't see Mexico pushing back on Trump administration policies. They know that their economy is hitched to ours completely and that there's really no viable alternative. You might see Canada experimenting with some kind of diversification at the margins, but I'd put Canada in that bucket too. So I think North America and Central America, like it or not, are going to have to live with this aggressive White House and its policies. South America has other options. Colombia is somewhat of a swing state. It's kind of in the middle of those two realities. But I see that those geopolitical, geoeconomic forces really steering the direction, the trajectory we're seeing here, much more than sort of the day-to-day policy of Trump or Biden or whoever else. OK, so you see that those courses as already being set. You don't see this muscular White House's operations in the region sort of splitting them into pro and anti-Washington? Not so far, but I will add that I do think there's There are some questions here around, for instance, the defense partnerships of the region. So historically, even for these countries that are trading now much more with China, Argentina, Peru, Brazil, et cetera, they're still, their preferred defense partner has been the United States. They mostly buy their military hardware from us or our allies. They rely on us for training. They usually follow our guidance on sensitive use of information technology, at least within their own defense secretariats, things like that. Now, what we are seeing in Colombia and Brazil is a little bit of a reaction, a rebalancing. I thought that a willingness to engage with China on defense issues, which previously even those leftist presidents of those two countries had not really been willing to do. They had not been willing to go there. They wanted to keep that relationship strong with the U.S., even as the economy went a different direction. And now you're seeing them reconsider.
Good talking to you. Thanks for talking us through that so clearly. Will Freeman from the Council on Foreign Relations.
Thanks for having me.